Welcome to the Politics and Media programme. With physical attacks on Muslims on the rise, anti-Muslim stories routinely running in some sections of the mainstream media, and a foreign policy in the Middle East that arguably relies on the stereotyping of Muslims, it's hardly surprising that Islamophobia has risen in the last decade. Last week, an Islamophobia Awareness Month was launched in order to try and rebalance the public debate. To discuss why the campaign is needed, with me in the studio, we have Sabi Dalu, Joint Secretary of Unite Against Fascism, and Omar El Hamdoun, President of the Muslim Association of Britain. Joining us on the phone is writer and broadcaster Richard Peppiatt, who sensationally quit the Daily Star newspaper last year, accusing it of anti-Muslim hate-mongering. But first we have Asif Bayat on the line, who is from the Enough Coalition Against Islamophobia that has helped to organise Islamophobia Awareness Month. Asif, just tell us, what's the campaign about?
Well, Muslims and non-Muslims will recognise that the worrying growth of anti-Muslim sentiment in everyday life. So if we look at examples within the media, newspapers like the Mail and the Express, with the police and the courts, just looking at the recent extradition and the case of Azhar Ahmed, we find that, on the grassroots level, people are being affected by this every day. So basically, a few prominent Islamic organizations, but not just Islamic organizations, it includes organizations like the UAF and Stop the War, we've come together in order to give a platform to this issue, to give people the confidence to speak about this.
And what's the programme of activities that's going to take place during the Awareness Month?
The organisations which are involved with IAM are using their networks and their contacts to engage with figures within Parliament, politicians, within media. So we do have events which will be taking place in the Houses of Parliament. We also hope to run workshops at the grassroots, so with Muslims, maybe advising them on what their rights are when it comes to, Islamophobia, how to report any issues that they have if they've experienced Islamophobic incidents, etc. And we also hope to have meetings with community leaders, mosque leaders, leaders from different organizations, and educating them on how they can portray the message, take the message forward to their congregations and to the people that follow them, and just giving confidence to people that suffer from this issue.
Okay, thanks very much, Asif. Sabi, you were at the launch meeting. What was your feeling about how it got off at the start?
Well, I think clearly there is definitely some concern amongst the Muslim community that Islamophobia needs to be addressed, and quite rightly so, because I think there are some quite disturbing statistics out there which reflect a rise of Islamophobia. So, for example, a survey conducted by the Tell Mama hotline, the hotline to report anti-Muslim hate crime, because obviously there is a problem of getting proper statistics for hate crime, because apart from the Metropolitan Police, police forces around the country don't record it as a specific category. But the figures from that hotline show that 70% of those reporting anti-Muslim hate crime are on women. And I find that quite disturbing, because with other sort of race hate crime previously, the majority of victims are actually young men, which is not surprised that they're the sort of main target of violent hate crime. So I was quite disturbed that such a large proportion would be against women, normally perpetrated by men. And I think that is not unrelated, or in fact very related to the Islamophobic way in which the whole issue of the niqab has been discussed, both in terms of the intervention by Jack Straw, which is when it really first started in this country about 6 years ago, and then the legislation in other European countries like France, for example, and proposed legislation in other European countries. The debate that it leads to here has been quite unhelpful and has, it appears, led to violent attacks on Muslim women. And also studies by other polls have shown, I think a YouGov poll for Channel 5 a couple of years ago showed that 50% of people associate the word Islam with extremism, and more worryingly, 52% associate the word Islam with terrorism. So therefore, you can understand how there is actually a long way to go in combating Islamophobia, because if there are such negative associations with the word Islam, then Islamophobia, therefore, to 50% of the population, is something that they would be quite openly admitting to, because they simply think Islamophobia is a phobia against extremism or a phobia against terrorism. So there is quite a long way to go to confronting and challenging and opposing Islamophobia. So we very much welcome the initiative.
Richard, let me just bring you in a moment, because Sabi's talked about the general picture and about the statistical evidence for the existence of Islamophobia. But I mean, you obviously had a particularly sort of close encounter at the Daily Star. Just tell us about what the issue was.
Well, I mean, the Daily Star is probably regarded as one of the papers that is seen as most Islamophobic, along with the Daily Express, running some very spurious stories, demonising Islam, really just to make cheap headlines. Tabloids do often take a rather binary view of the world, in which everything can be divided down to good and evil. But I certainly felt that Muslims were being particularly targeted, and there's some famous stories that you may well be aware of, sort of the Muslim-only public toilets, etc., which were all but completely fabricated with a design on just presenting Muslims as being incompatible with sort of the concept of Britishness. And for me, I'm very ashamed I didn't get out before I did, but there came a point in which I sort of thought, we need to sort of make a stand about this, I suppose. And it is difficult to get the issue the attention it deserves. I mean, I gave evidence at the Leveson inquiry, and I raised the matter. But I mean, it really is. Sometimes I feel that it's not taken seriously enough as an issue within the press. The idea that you still can't really make third-party complaints to the Press Complaints Commission if you're a Muslim who happens to be offended by a story. They normally tell you to go and get on your bike. They're not interested. I don't really think that editors are particularly interested in taking it seriously, and I think that that's reflected by the composition of your panel there. I'm sure that if you called up any of the editor of the Mail or the Express or the Daily Star, they would refuse to have a debate at all. And certainly at the Leveson inquiry, when Islamophobic stories were put to people like Dawn Neeson, who edits the Daily Star, she simply denied that it even exists. She didn't recognise that it would be conceived as Islamophobic, and it was just this willful blindness that unfortunately they seem to be able to get away with. And I certainly felt, it's very easy when you're working in a newsroom to get in that bubble where you don't really think about the consequences of what you're writing. But it did come a point where, for me, I sort of thought to myself, this does have an effect. People do read these things, and they are used as justifications for hate crime. These sort of stories that are printed in the Mail and the Express and the Star, they do end up on far-right forums being used as justifications to go out and attack people and abuse people. And I think that is a very, very, very serious issue. That whatever new regulatory system pops up for the press really needs to address and take seriously.
Thanks very much, Richard. Omar, I mean, in the introduction, Asif was saying that part of the purpose of the campaign is to kind of make people within the Muslim community itself aware of the issue and to raise it in the mosques and so forth and so on. But some people might think, well, surely that community is already aware. But do you think there is a specific need to raise this as a political project?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about amongst Muslims, definitely there is a need, because if we go to basic things about reporting, for example, a lot of Muslims, whether I don't think it's just because they are Muslims, but certainly in certain circumstances, a lot of this crime, which may be labelled under Islamophobia or hate crime, is left aside. People don't want to report it because they just don't want maybe the hassle of reporting, or they don't want to. They feel that it's just going to be extra grief. Sometimes it could be small things, like maybe being called a name in the street, or some sort of problem between the children at school or whatever, or at the school gates and so on. People just maybe say, I don't want the hassle. But what happens is, the more that it's not reported, then obviously a lot of this is going outside the radar. The other thing is a lot of Muslims maybe feel that this is not Islamophobia in the sense that it's more just like aimed at them because they happen to be a different color, for example, or they're just, you know, wearing different clothes or whatever. So again, not reporting it doesn't allow us to really find the big picture. So I think that's the message that we want to really get out in this month, is that there is very important that the Muslims, and not just the Muslims, like Sabi mentioned as well, the police really need to, throughout the other police authorities throughout the Britain, to actually make reporting or make a specific category for Islamophobia so that it can be categorized this. That will help to give the evidence a bigger perspective.
I mean, Sabi, do you want to just sort of perhaps comment on the point that Richard made, that there is a sort of symbiotic relationship between what happens in the mainstream media and what happens with the far-right organisations, which of course you're centrally involved in challenging. I mean, there is a dynamic there, isn't there? Well,
definitely. I mean, I suppose the sharpest illustration of this is something that Nick Griffin said, which was quoted in the study that Peter Abel and James Jones did about Islamophobia in the media. And there was a quote in there by Nick Griffin, the BNP leader himself, which said that the reason why they focus on Muslims and Islam is because that is what is focused on in the national media. He said something like, of course, we hate Jews and we oppose, you know, lesbian and gay communities, but if we banged on about that, people would think we're mad. But if we bang on about Islam and Muslims, then it chimes with what people are hearing and seeing on their TV screens virtually on a daily basis. So there is most definitely a relationship between the discussion and debate in the media and the rise of the far right and the way in which they use that to their advantage, and also hate crimes on the ground, which is very worrying. Plus also the whole debate around the niqab, for example. I think 68% of people surveyed for another opinion poll said that they favoured the banning of the niqab. And I don't believe that's because British people see women wearing the niqab, you know, so frequently that they find it worrying or disturbing. I think it's purely because of the debate in the media, because obviously most people won't even come across a woman that wears a niqab because so few Muslim women actually wear it. I mean, of course, you know, we support the right of a Muslim woman who chooses to wear the niqab, but the point is so few wear it. So why the attention? Why does national legislation need to be passed in some European countries? So there's definitely a relationship between the media and the far right and hate crimes on the ground. And so it's definitely something that we need journalists, perhaps first and foremost, to be challenging from within.
Yeah, I mean that quote from Nick Griffin. I mean, you were paraphrasing there, but I mean people can find the exact quote on the UAF website and various other places because it's in the public domain now.
Yeah,
I think the exact words he said were, you know, if we attacked Mr. Cohen the tailor, people would find that offensive, but if we attack Muslims, then it's a different question. But anyway, if people want to look at that, they can find it on the website. So let me bring Richard back in. Richard, because you know we talk now about the relationship, kind of, you know, if you like, down from the mainstream press and towards the far right. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about the kind of atmosphere that creates the kind of conditions under which it's possible to write those stories in the newsrooms, because I think many people would say that that's partly generated by mainstream politicians and by certainly the justifications for the wars in the Middle East over the last 10 years. Were you aware of that? Was that something that you were aware of when you were engaged in these discussions in the Star?
Well, I think that every society, for as far back as you can think, it had its cartoon baddie. I think that almost, you know, at one point it was Jews in Europe, and now post 9/11 and post 7/7, I think that Muslims are the easy scapegoat for a lot of social ills which aren't related to Muslims at all. But we need someone to blame. You know, I think it's a natural human thing, and unfortunately, the media often encourage that process. They always want someone to target their angst towards. And, you know, in the context of the fact that the media industry, the print industry is dying, and, you know, circulations are going down, so there's always this pressure to find more and more sensationalist stories. And, you know, instead of appealing to the rational of the reader, increasingly I think that newspapers appeal to the emotional and the knee-jerk. And I think that is how we find it playing out. in the press, and there's not an attempt to really challenge some of the. There are people out there who do read papers like the Daily Star and other tabloids who do have prejudice against Muslims, and that is something that they are. Is something that they're concerned about. But, I think the responsibility of journalism is to try and enlighten these people and try and educate them, not to feed into their prejudice because you think it will sell your paper and keep your circulation up. I think that's irresponsible. The vast majority of journalists in newsrooms are not prejudiced people. And that does not mean that they never ever write anything which could be deemed prejudice. And I think that's an issue that has to be going on in newsrooms about the way they're structured. They're very authoritarian, and there's not an ability for journalists to bring their conscience into it and say, I don't want to write that, unfortunately. And that's something we need to look at, as an industry itself.
Omar, do you think there should be more work done directed specifically at the press for exactly the reasons that Richard refers to?
Yeah, I think there definitely should be something more done there. It's unfortunate, as Richard mentions, is that it's those kind of news that sort of sells. People are always looking for. And the recent scandal that we had with the News of the World just shows that, although it's nothing to do with Muslims, but it's all to do with irresponsible and even in some occasions criminal behaviour, all in the name of getting good news. So that's why I think the Levinson inquiry has been set up, and hopefully there will come some good results from that, where the press at least realises that what they are doing is they are causing more problems in Britain and British society, which in the long term is bad for society. Yes, the government has to step in this regards, because if newspapers are causing more hatred in whatever way, that's actually damaging for the sort of the slogans that the government is calling for, like cohesion and engagement and things like that. If while you are building, there are people who are actually destroying the very foundations of society.
Richard, do you think Levinson will take any of this on board? It seems that Levinson's attention is very much elsewhere, when it might be argued this is one of the most prominent examples of press misreporting and bias.
Well, yeah, it's very hard to tell what he's thinking and how much it sort of seeped into his mentality. I mean, it was brought up by various witnesses, and I like to think that it's something he's going to take on board. And I think that it's very important for your viewers and yourselves to really focus on, because the Levinson report will come out by the end of the month, and there's a real anti-Levinson backlash has already begun in the mainstream press, trying to rubbish the report before it's even arrived. And it very much is a responsibility for people who are concerned with media coverage to get themselves inside and to make their voices heard and say, no, we want these recommendations, and we're not going to let it be brushed under the carpet. And so that's something that's a battle that's going to go on over the next sort of 6 months to a year, is trying to make sure that the press don't get their way and sweep all these reforms away and carry on as normal, because that's very much what they would like to do.
So, Sabi, how much do you think that the problem, obviously you're dealing with it at the end, that it most affects the far right, but how much of it do you think actually originates in the political mainstream? Because, there's a very, very heavy steer, I think, coming from mainstream politicians over these issues.
Yeah, the truth is, fascist organisations like the BNP and the EDL didn't emerge from nowhere out of a vacuum. They did so precisely because of the growth of racism generally, but specifically Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism since 9/11. Because I think you quite rightly said that it was a product of international wars, particularly Iraq, which was very unpopular. So in some ways it was part of an agenda which tried to drum up support for the war in Iraq by portraying Islam and extremism as the enemy in a context where the war was very, very unpopular. So I think that if I'm honest, I think that the majority of it is, most of the problem is what we see in the mainstream, but the sharpest end of it is what we see in terms of hate crimes on the street, and organised campaigns by fascist organisations, with perhaps I'm not sure which is worse, where the BNP's attempts to get electoral support, or violent attacks by the EDL, because both are very dangerous and are part of one another. But also, in addition to the media, I think politicians have intervened in an unhelpful way. So as I said earlier, it was actually Jack Straw. It seemed sort of out of nowhere, but it was, probably a deliberate attempt to just sort of see where British public opinion was at on the issue of the niqab. And thankfully, at the moment, all mainstream political parties are united in well, their line is that banning the niqab or religious dress in any way is an un-British thing to do. So that's good, and I think we need to make sure that we prevent such dangerous legislation from ever being passed in this country. But also, David Cameron last year in his speech in Munich. It was a deliberate attempt, in my opinion, to stoke up support for the Tories, because at that point the Tories were at their lowest point in the opinion polls since the 2010 general election, because of course, their policies of massive cuts to the public sector is leading to unemployment, low pay, and so on. And so that is very unpopular in itself. So instead of changing their policy on that front, an attempt was made to just sort of distract the population and sort of stoke up racism, which unfortunately has worked for the Tory party, but I don't think it's possible for them to sustain that in the long term.
The kind of foreign policy element of this has been on hold during the course of the US elections, but do you worry that that as those elections are concluded, the whole business of of dealing with Iran, as they call it, will create another wave of this? Because part of the justification is, look, they're all mad mullahs, da-di-da-di-da, and this is how we get back into this cycle.
Yeah, I think, if we just go back a little bit, when we talk about like Islamophobia and being an Islamophobia as a phobia, as opposed to anti-Muslim hatred, I think there's two differences, and it's very important that we maybe during this month it's highlighted that Islamophobia is the practice where people maybe are. There's a lot of scaremongering, and so people act that way because they don't know what's happening. It's irrational, it's illogical, so they attack a Muslim in the street, or they pull off a hijab of a woman, or whatever. Whereas there's another element, which is the anti-Muslim or anti-Islam agenda, anti-Islam hatred, where people know exactly what they are doing. They are doing it for political reasons or for bigger reasons. Maybe it's to do with energy and oil and resources, etc. So I think that aspect of it will obviously, there are people out there, busy writing all the, the way they think things should go, especially with, like, say, in Iran and in the Arab world, they are planning so that it does take a certain type of direction. As Sabi mentioned, end of the day, war, although politicians decide, but it does need some sort of backing from the public, and the way to do that is to drum up that kind of Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred.
Well, thanks for that, and that's where we're going to have to leave it for this part of the programme, but please do rejoin us after the break, when we'll be discussing the issue of whether ethnic minorities get fair treatment as old people in our care homes.